13 of the best shooters the United States military had ever produced stood on that range and failed, one by one. Each man walked back with nothing but excuses and the desert wind at his back. The target was 4 kilometers out, nearly 2.5 miles, in crosswind conditions that made the shot, by every calculation, physically impossible. Then a woman nobody had ever heard of stepped forward from the sidelines. She didn't raise her hand. She didn't ask for permission the way someone begging does. She simply said quietly that she wanted to try. The laughter started before she even finished the sentence. Nobody laughs at the end of this story. If you're watching this right now, drop a comment and tell me what city you're from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Like, follow and stay with me until the very last second. You won't regret it. The convoy had been running 40 minutes late out of Fort Carson when the call came through, and by the time Captain Evelyn Hart pulled her truck into the gravel lot at Blackstone Proving Grounds, the morning's first round of qualifications was already underway. She sat in the cab for a moment with the engine off, listening to the distant crack of rifles carry across open desert. The sound rolled over the flats in waves, thin and sharp, absorbed almost immediately by the dry air. Nevada in July had a particular quality to its silence. It wasn't quiet so much as empty, as if the heat had burned away everything except the basic facts of the landscape. She reached across to the passenger seat and picked up the clipboard. Supply manifests. Calibration schedules for 2 weapons storage facilities. 1 deferred maintenance request for a generator unit at the north perimeter that had been sitting in her queue for 3 weeks. This was her day. These were her concerns. Evelyn climbed out of the truck. She was 37 years old, medium height, with the kind of build that suggested physical competence without advertising it. Her uniform was clean but unremarkable. No ribbons beyond the basic service awards. No unit patches that would draw the eye. She wore her hair pulled back tightly, the way women in the military learn to wear it when they've stopped thinking about how they look and started thinking about whether they'll get through the day without something going wrong. She walked toward the range administration building, clipboard tucked under her arm, and almost immediately had to stop to let a group of men pass. There were 8 of them, moving in a loose cluster, and they had the particular posture of people who knew exactly who they were in any given room. These were the advanced marksmanship candidates, hand-selected, individually screened, the kind of shooters who got written about in training program reports. She recognized the unit patches. 2 from 1st SFOD Delta, 3 from DEVGRU. 1 she didn't recognize, which meant he'd probably been scrubbed of identifiers. None of them looked at her as they passed. She kept walking. The range itself was built in a long east-west axis to catch consistent morning light, with a main firing line of 20 positions and a secondary observation platform set back 40 meters. Behind the firing line, a cluster of portable command tents had been erected in a horseshoe configuration, and in the center of that horseshoe, she could see General Nathan Cross standing with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the range through binoculars. Cross was 52 and looked every year of it. He had a gray-flecked jaw and the eyes of a man who had stood in too many places where things went wrong and had made his peace with that fact. He ran the Army's Special Operations Training Command out of Fort Bragg, but he'd been brought out to Blackstone specifically for this program evaluation. His presence alone indicated how seriously someone in the Pentagon was taking today's results. Standing to Cross's right, with the self-possessed posture of a man who treated every inch of ground he stood on as territory he personally owned, was Colonel Victor Kane. Evelyn recognized Kane from his file. She'd processed logistics requests for his unit twice in the past 18 months and had never met him in person. In the file, he'd seemed like a competent officer. In person, he was something else, a man whose confidence had calcified over the years into something closer to contempt. He was broad-shouldered, gray at the temples, with the kind of handsome that had probably gotten him a lot of things early in his career and taught him the wrong lessons about why. She found the range administration clerk, dropped off 2 of the 3 manifest forms, and was turning back toward the lot when she heard the next shooter take position. She stopped. Not because she intended to. She stopped the way you stop when something pulls at a part of you that you've been deliberately ignoring, and the pull is strong enough that you don't immediately recognize it for what it is. The shooter on the line was good. She could tell from the way he settled. Slow, deliberate, no wasted movement in the pre-shot routine. He spent nearly 4 minutes behind the rifle before he fired. The crack was clean. She heard the radio response from the downrange observation team almost 8 seconds later. "Miss, came in 3 meters low and 11 right." The shooter sat up from the rifle and looked at his spotter's data card. He shook his head once. Kane said something from behind the rope line. She was too far away to hear the words, but she heard the tone. Clipped, dismissive. The shooter picked up his gear and walked off the line, and the next man moved up. Evelyn stood and watched. She wasn't counting shots consciously, but somewhere underneath the part of her brain that was tracking supply manifests and maintenance requests, another part was running the numbers. Wind velocity at the line, estimated at 11 to 14 knots from the southwest, which meant the gusts were probably variable by 6 or 7 knots at distance. Temperature around 104 degrees Fahrenheit, which would affect both powder burn rate and air density. The target was reportedly at 4 kilometers. At that range, even a 2-knot error in wind reading could put your round 2 or 3 feet off point of aim. The problem wasn't the shooters. The problem was the problem. She walked back to her truck. She sat in the cab for a long time. On the back seat, under a canvas tarp she'd had there for so long she'd stopped seeing it, was a rifle case. It was olive drab with worn aluminum hardware and a handle that had been wrapped and rewrapped in black electrical tape until the original grip material was completely buried. The latches had been replaced twice. The case was not new. It was not military issue. It was hers, in the way that very few things in her life actually were. She didn't touch it. She got out of the truck and walked back to the range. By early afternoon, the score was 12 men, 12 misses. The mood had shifted from focused professionalism to something edgier. These were elite shooters, men who had won competitions, who had real-world confirmed kills at extraordinary distances, who had built personal and professional identities around being exactly this good at exactly this thing. Failing at a range evolution in front of each other, in front of General Cross, in front of Kane's running commentary, was producing a specific kind of friction that showed up in short sentences and averted eye contact. Evelyn had stayed. She hadn't intended to. But she'd finished her paperwork in the administration building and found herself back at the observation platform with a bottle of water and her notebook. The notebook was a plain green government-issue field book. She'd been writing in it for an hour. Small numbers, arranged in columns. Wind readings every 3 minutes, correlated against the distant range flags she could see through a spotting scope she'd borrowed from the administration clerk without explaining why she needed it. The 13th shooter had just missed badly, almost 5 meters right, which indicated he'd overcorrected for a wind gust that died before the round arrived. General Cross lowered his binoculars. He turned to Kane and said something quiet. Kane shook his head. "We can try again tomorrow with adjusted equipment parameters," Kane said, loud enough now that Evelyn could hear him. "The conditions today are outside the expected." "The conditions are the conditions." Cross's voice was flat. "That's the point. Sir, if I may, no system in current inventory was designed to be reliable at this range and wind variance. We're asking men to beat physics. I'm aware of what we're asking." Evelyn closed her notebook. She walked to the rope line. She wasn't sure exactly why she did it. That wasn't quite true. She knew why. She just hadn't fully decided to until she was already moving, and once she was moving, stopping would have required a different kind of decision than continuing, so she continued. "General Cross," she said. Cross turned. Kane turned. 6 other men who were standing nearby turned. She was standing at the rope line with her notebook and her water bottle and her unremarkable uniform, and she was aware of how she looked. She had always been aware of how she looked in moments like this. Not self-conscious in the way of someone who cares about appearance, but analytically aware, the way you track any variable that affects an outcome. "Sir, I'd like to request permission to attempt the qualification shot." The silence lasted maybe 2 seconds. Then someone laughed. It started with one of the DevGru men. A short, involuntary sound, quickly covered, but it broke the seal, and within 4 seconds there were multiple people laughing, including one of the range safety officers who should have known better. The sound spread the way fire spreads in dry grass, too fast to trace back to a single source, self-sustaining the moment it found air. Kane didn't laugh. He did something worse. He smiled, slowly, the way a man smiles when something confirms exactly what he already believes about the world. "Captain," he glanced at her name tape. "Hart. Your logistics, correct? Yes, sir. Meaning your current assignment is supply chain management. That's correct. And you want to attempt a 4-kilometer precision shot that just failed 13 consecutive special operations shooters. Yes, sir. The smile stayed. On what basis? She held up the notebook. I've been tracking wind and atmospheric data for the last 90 minutes. I have a correction model that I think accounts for the variable gust pattern. A correction model? Kane repeated the words in the tone of a man examining something unpleasant on the bottom of his boot. You built a correction model for a shot that the Army's top precision shooters couldn't complete. Yes, sir. And what weapon do you intend to use? I have a rifle in my truck. More laughter, louder this time. One of the Delta men shook his head and looked at the ground, and she could see from the set of his shoulders that he wasn't entirely comfortable with the sound, but wasn't going to object to it either. Kane opened his mouth. Let her shoot. Everyone stopped. General Cross hadn't raised his voice. He was still looking downrange, binoculars hanging from one hand, and he spoke as if he was simply continuing a private thought out loud. Sir, Kane started, we've spent 6 hours failing to solve this problem. If she has a solution, let's see it. Cross finally turned and looked at Evelyn directly. His expression was unreadable in the specific way of experienced commanders who've learned not to broadcast their intentions. Captain Hart, get your rifle. She walked back to her truck alone. The distance from the observation platform to the parking lot was roughly 200 meters across gravel and hard pan, and she covered it at the same pace she'd come. Not too fast and not too slow, and she kept her face neutral the way she'd learned to keep it in environments where showing what you felt cost you something. Her hands were steady. This surprised her, a little, in the way that it always surprised her. The fact that the steadiness was there, still, after years of deliberately not using it. The truck cab was brutally hot. She reached through the window, unlocked it from the inside, and pulled the back door open. The canvas tarp. The case underneath. She stood there for a moment with her hand on the case's top handle. The last time she'd used this rifle was 4 years ago. In a location she was not permitted to name even in private communication, under circumstances she'd spent considerable effort not thinking about since. The rifle itself didn't know any of that. It was metal and glass and carbon fiber, several hundred specific components arranged with extreme precision. It didn't have a history. She was the one who had the history. She picked up the case and carried it back to the range. Asham. The crowd that had gathered since the morning's evolution had grown. Word traveled fast on a military installation, especially word of the unexpected and absurd variety. And by the time Evelyn set the case down on the firing bench and began unlocking the latches, there were perhaps 40 people standing behind the observation rope. She was aware of them the way you're aware of weather. As a condition you factor into the situation, not as a particular concern. The case opened. The rifle was a bolt action, built on a long-action chassis she'd had custom-fitted to her dimensions 12 years ago. The barrel was a match-grade, heavy contour, 28 inches, with a muzzle brake she'd modified herself. The scope was a first focal plane model with a ranging reticle, and it wore an anti-reflective device over the objective that made it look, to the unfamiliar eye, slightly strange. The stock had been adjusted and shimmied and rebedded so many times that it had accumulated a kind of archaeology of modifications visible only to someone who knew what they were looking at. The crowd was doing the thing crowds do, making comparative judgments based on surface appearance. That's a civilian rig. That scope looks older than me. Is that electrical tape on the handguard? She didn't respond to any of it. She removed the rifle from the case and set it on the bench, then arranged her notebook and a small calculator to her left. She adjusted the shooting position the same way she always adjusted it. Seat, elbows, left-hand support, cheek weld. Her body remembered the geometry before her mind caught up. Then she began reading the wind. She was not using the calculator for basic arithmetic. She was using it to reconcile 2 separate data streams. Her own direct observations of the mirage shimmer above the desert floor, which gave her air movement information at eye level, and the flag readings she'd been taking all afternoon, which represented movement at approximately 2 meters off the ground. The Coriolis effect at this latitude at 4 kilometers was worth approximately 8 inches of drift. She already had that in her data. The atmospheric density calculation she'd derived from the ambient temperature and her estimated elevation above sea level. She worked quietly. the notebook pages filled with notations. Kane walked to within a few feet of the shooting bench. She was aware of his presence before she saw him, the sound of his footsteps on the compacted range surface. "Captain, we'd like to move this along. I need 4 more minutes. Our range personnel have other—" "4 minutes, Colonel." She didn't look up from the notebook. A pause. She could feel him calibrating how to respond to that. 4 minutes, he said. His voice had gone flat in a particular way. She kept writing. The wind shifted. She clocked it. A 6-knot gust from the southwest, lasting approximately 8 seconds, then dying back to the baseline. That was the pattern she'd been watching all afternoon. The gusts came in on a roughly 12-minute cycle, with a predictable duration. The previous shooters had been getting caught by the gusts because they were either shooting into them or because their shot timing was such that the round arrived downrange during a different wind phase than the one they'd read at the line. She finished the last calculation and put the pen down. She settled behind the rifle. The scope picture came up immediately. Clear, steady, the distant target just visible as a geometric shape against the pale desert backdrop. She knew her zero, knew her drops to this range, had the elevation correction already dialed. She put her finger lightly against the trigger without taking up pressure. And she waited. The range was quiet now. Not the manufactured quiet of people being polite. The real quiet of people who have stopped being certain. One of the DevGru men who had been quietly scoffing 2 hours ago was now standing very still with his arms crossed, watching. She breathed. She tracked the mirage through the scope, watching the way it bent and straightened and bent again. She felt the air on the back of her left hand. She watched the flags in her peripheral vision without looking directly at them. The pattern she'd charted said the next gust would arrive in approximately 90 seconds and last 8 to 10 seconds. After the gust died, there would be a window of approximately 40 to 50 seconds where the wind dropped to near baseline velocity, the most consistent reading of the day. She waited for the gust. It came. She tracked it through the scope, watching the mirage flatten and reform. She counted. 8 seconds. 9. The flags dropped. She settled her breathing into a long, slow cycle. At the bottom of the exhale, when her body was still and the scope picture was settled and every calculation she'd made in the past 90 minutes was loaded and waiting, she squeezed. The rifle broke cleanly. Recoil moved through her the way it had always moved through her. Absorbed, managed, already part of the past by the time the muzzle came back down. She worked the bolt and kept the scope picture. Habit. 4 seconds. 4.5. The radio on the range officer's belt crackled. Everyone in the observation area had gone motionless. "Firing line, this is downrange observation. Please confirm last shooter." The range officer keyed his handset. "Downrange, 1 round fired. Captain Evelyn Hart. Stand by for impact confirmation." A pause that felt much longer than it was. "Confirmed hit, center mass, within 2 inches of point of aim." Nobody moved. Evelyn removed her eye from the scope and sat up from the rifle. She began disassembling her position with the same methodical pace she'd assembled it. Notebook, calculator. She didn't look at the crowd. The silence lasted perhaps 5 full seconds. Then someone exhaled loudly. Then another voice, one of the Delta operators, said quietly but distinctly enough to carry, "What the hell?" And just as the shock was beginning to convert itself into noise, into the questions and the crowding forward, and the beginning of a completely different kind of conversation than anyone had expected to have today. General Cross had not moved from his position, but his eyes were fixed on Evelyn with an expression that was no longer unreadable. It was an expression of recognition, specific and urgent recognition, the way a man looks when a face he's been searching for in the wrong places for years finally appears in front of him without warning. He knew that rifle. He had seen it once before, in a canyon 9 years ago, in a country he was not permitted to name. His mouth opened slightly and then closed. Evelyn was latching the case shut, her back to the observation platform, completely unaware of the way General Nathan Cross was staring at her like a man who had just watched a ghost shoot a rifle. And Colonel Kane who had smiled, Kane who had managed the laughter, with the comfort of a man providing entertainment for a crowd he controlled, was pulling out his phone, and the expression on his face had changed into something that was no longer comfortable at all. He typed a number from memory. The call connected on the second ring. "We have a problem," he said quietly, turning away from the crowd. "I need you to pull a file. The name is Hart. Evelyn Hart. Captain, Army Logistics. And I need to know exactly who she is before this gets any further." He listened, then, slowly, he went very still. "How classified?" he said. The answer made him close his eyes. Kane's thumb moved across the phone screen once more after the call ended. A short, reflexive gesture. The kind of thing a man does when he needs something to do with his hands and doesn't want anyone to see that he needs it. Then he pocketed the phone and turned back toward the range, with an expression that had been carefully reconstructed into something neutral. The crowd had not dispersed. If anything, it had thickened. People were moving toward the firing line in the unhurried but purposeful way of men who'd been standing at a distance watching something they didn't understand and had now decided they needed to be closer to it. The range officer was speaking into his radio. One of the downrange observers had already started the walk back from the target position, which was unusual. That walk typically only happened during a scheduled break. The man was moving at a pace that suggested he wanted to arrive before whatever was about to happen had already happened without him. Evelyn was still at the bench. She hadn't stood up to receive congratulations. She hadn't turned around to face the crowd. She was completing the rifle case latch with the focused attention of someone who considers a task incomplete until the equipment is fully secured, which was either deeply professional or deliberately avoidant, depending on how you read it. Both things were probably true. General Cross had not moved from his position at the command tent. He was watching Evelyn with the same fixed quality he'd had for the past 4 minutes. And the man standing to his left, a younger officer, a major whose name Evelyn hadn't registered, had noticed the general's expression and was now watching it with a specific kind of attention, the kind that junior officers develop for reading their commanders in moments that don't have obvious protocols. Cross finally blinked. He looked down at the binoculars still hanging from his right hand, as if he'd forgotten they were there. He set them on the field table next to him. "Get me her service record," he said. The major didn't ask which service record. "Sir, all of it or all of it? Whatever's accessible in the system and whatever isn't." He paused. "Start with whatever isn't." The major left quickly. Kane had positioned himself near the rope line, close enough to General Cross's tent to be in the conversation if Cross turned toward him, but not so close that he appeared to be hovering. It was a well-practiced piece of spatial politics. He stood with his arms loosely at his sides, weight balanced, the posture of a man managing his composure with considerable practice. Cross turned toward him. Victor, not Colonel, not Kane. The use of a first name in a setting like this carried its own specific message. "What do you know about Captain Hart?" Kane's expression didn't shift in any way that would be visible to someone who wasn't specifically looking for it. "She runs supply chain out of Fort Carson, sir. Solid record in logistics. No red flags. 3 years at Carson." "Before Carson. I'd have to check the file." "Yes," Cross said. "You would." Something in his tone closed the conversation. Kane understood he was being told something oblique and chose not to push on it. He nodded once and stepped back. Evelyn picked up the case and turned around. The crowd had parted in the way crowds part for people they're uncertain about, not making way with obvious deference, but creating space through the collective, slightly awkward rearrangement of 40 people who didn't want to be the ones standing directly in her path. She walked through carrying the case in her right hand and the notebook under her left arm, eyes at approximately the level of the horizon. Looking at faces without looking at any particular one of them, she nearly made it to the edge of the observation platform before the first man spoke. Rourke, the DevGru operator who'd gone still after the shot, stepped forward slightly. He was maybe 35, jaw carrying 2 or 3 days of growth, built like someone who'd been doing serious physical work since before he was old enough to vote. He had the posture of a man who'd earned the right to take up exactly the amount of space he was taking up. "That was a hell of a shot, ma'am." She stopped. Rourke had said it the way men say things when they mean them and don't have a habit of saying things they don't, and that combination had a gravity to it. She wasn't prepared to walk through. "Thank you," she said. "The wind correction, the gust cycle timing." He shook his head once, not disbelief, but the specific expression of a professional encountering something that recalibrates his sense of what's possible. "I've been doing this 14 years. I've never watched someone read a range like that." The data was there. You just need enough time to build the picture. We had 40 minutes per shooter. That's not enough time. No, she agreed. It wasn't. He looked at the case. What platform is that? Bolt action, custom build, old chassis. Chambering? She paused for one beat. 338 Lapua, modified feed geometry. He raised an eyebrow. Modified how? Altered case neck dimension. Improves consistency in temperature extremes. Where'd you learn to work on feed geometry? She picked up the case and started walking. Have a good evening, Sergeant Rourke. She heard him watching her go. The particular silence a man makes when he's deciding whether to let something go. He let it go. Most people did, eventually, which was something she'd come to rely on without being proud of it. She made it to her truck. She put the case into the back and stood for a moment with the rear door open, and the desert heat settled onto her shoulders like something with actual mass. Her shirt was damp at the center of her back. Her hands, steady through 4 seconds of trigger prep, through the shot, through the aftermath, were now doing the faint, barely visible thing she recognized and hated. Not trembling. Something more like the minute surface vibration of a string that's been plucked and hasn't finished resonating. She breathed out through her nose. Slow count. The kind of regulation you teach yourself after enough situations where you needed it badly enough to figure it out on your own. 4 years without the rifle. 4 years of exactly what her assignment was supposed to look like. Calibration schedules and supply routes, and the carefully maintained shape of a life that didn't ask anything of her, she couldn't provide without opening something she'd decided to keep closed. She'd known, the moment she pulled the case from under the canvas tarp, that the shot wouldn't end it. She'd known before she walked back to the range. She'd known when she set up behind the rifle and felt the familiar geometry of the position settle around her like something remembering her. You don't do what she'd done for as long as she'd done it without developing an accurate sense of consequence. She'd known, and she'd done it anyway. She was trying to understand what that meant about her when she noticed Kane. He was standing near the far edge of the lot with 2 men she didn't recognize. Not uniforms, not the standard contractor look either. Something in between, the specific presentation of men who are officially nothing in particular. One of them had a phone out. The other was listening to Kane with the quality of attention that belongs to people who are receiving instructions and intend to act on them before anything changes. She watched for 5 seconds. Then she turned toward the range administration building. She heard about the investigation from Specialist Delgado. Delgado was 22 and had the look of someone who had learned things at this installation that he hadn't entirely figured out how to carry yet. He found her in the break room 40 minutes after the shot, holding a full coffee mug he hadn't drunk from, wearing the expression of a man who'd overheard something he wasn't sure was his business, and had decided, against his better instincts, that it probably was. "Ma'am," he said, "I don't know if this is my place." "Go ahead." "Colonel Kane is with the JAG rep, the one on call for range evaluations." He looked at the mug. "He's raising the question of unauthorized weapon use at a supervised military range evolution." Evelyn set her own mug down. "His position," Delgado continued with the careful phrasing of someone relaying something he'd heard through a door, "is that your rifle wasn't on the approved equipment list for this evaluation, that the result can't stand because the weapon wasn't cleared through range safety prior to the evolution commencing." She sat with that. Technically, it wasn't wrong. The evaluation maintained a list of approved platforms. Her rifle wasn't on it because her rifle had never existed within any documentation system that today's range officers would have had visibility into. The oversight was genuine. It was also irrelevant in any practical sense because the senior officer present, General Cross, had verbally authorized her participation, and that authorization superseded a pre-printed equipment list by about 4 levels of command authority. Kane knew this, which meant the unauthorized weapon question wasn't his actual position. It was his opening move. "Thank you, Specialist," she said. Delgado nodded with the visible relief of a man who delivered news he wasn't sure he should deliver, and had been told it was okay that he did. He left, and she sat alone in the break room with the air conditioning making a sound behind the main vent that indicated a loose panel somewhere she probably could have located and fixed in 10 minutes if this were a different kind of day. She finished her coffee. Then she went to find General Cross. He was in the command tent with Major Aldrich, the 2 of them at the field table with a laptop between them. When she came to the entrance, Cross looked up immediately, which told her he'd been expecting her, or expecting someone, and had been watching the tent entrance without appearing to. He nodded at Aldrich. Aldrich moved to the far end of the tent with the discretion of a man who understood his role in this particular moment. Evelyn stepped in. "Captain Hart," Cross said. "General, I'd like a few minutes, sir." "You were going to come find me anyway," he said. "Before or after you heard about Kane's inquiry?" "After." "I heard about it before you did." He gestured toward the camp chair across the table. "Sit down." She sat. He stayed standing, which she registered as a deliberate choice rather than an oversight. 3 years at Fort Carson," he said. "Supply chain." "Yes, sir." "Before Carson." "Various assignments." He said the word back at her. "Various," in the tone of a man who finds a word inadequate and wants you to hear exactly how inadequate he finds it. Then he moved to the other side of the table and sat, which shifted the space between them. Not superior and subordinate processing a situation. Two people, close range, having a real conversation. "I've requested your file," he said. The immediate response was a delay notification. "Classification hold." "I know, sir." The classification level indicated is not one I encounter often. He set his forearms on the table. 9 years ago, Anbar Valley. The operation name is still restricted, and I won't say it, but you'd know the one. Evelyn kept her hands flat on her knees. My team was pinned in a canyon for close to 4 hours. 7 men, 1 casualty, ammunition running critical, extraction window already pushed twice. He looked at the table between them. Then 3 shots, distances our spotter estimated between 3 and 3.5 kilometers. Adverse angle. Wind near dusk, which is its own problem. He looked up. All 3 targets down. Contact ceased. We got out. The tent fabric moved slightly in the evening wind. Outside, the desert had gone deep orange. The shooter was never identified, Cross continued. The mission didn't exist officially. My team filed what we were told to file. I moved on. A pause that had weight in it. I never stopped thinking about who it was. Evelyn said nothing. She was aware of her own breathing, aware of keeping it at a pace that looked like calm rather than control. "The rifle," he said. "The muzzle brake profile, the barrel contour. I had about 4 seconds on glass during the canyon incident. In 4 seconds, you can sometimes see enough, if you know what you're looking at." He let the sentence sit there. "Sir," she said carefully, "I don't think this is a conversation I can have with you right now." "No comment." "No comment, sir." Cross made a sound that wasn't laughter exactly. Something more compressed. "That's more interesting than a denial." He looked at her for a long moment. "Are you telling me you did something wrong in those files?" "No, sir." "Are you telling me the people who sealed those files did something wrong?" The pause this time was longer. "Some of them," she said. "Yes." The quality of silence in the tent changed. Cross stood. He was taller than the seated conversation had suggested, not imposing in a physical sense, but present in the way of someone who'd stood in enough hard situations that their body had simply learned to occupy space differently. "Kane is using the unauthorized weapon angle to buy time," he said. "He knows it won't hold. The RSO will note that I verbally authorized your participation, which supersedes the equipment list. Kane knows that, which means his goal isn't to invalidate the result. His goal is to keep the conversation about process and equipment long enough to get information he doesn't have yet. He made a call right after the shot," Evelyn said. 2 men, civilian adjacent. They were in the parking lot within 20 minutes. Cross's attention sharpened in a visible way. "Description." She gave it. He listened without taking notes. "He knows something already," she said. "Before he pulled your file, he recognized the situation faster than he should have if he was starting from 0. "Agreed." Cross was quiet for a moment, working through something. "The 4 soldiers, the ones connected to those sealed missions." Evelyn was very still. "Their families," he said. "What were they told?" She looked at the table. "Training accident, no further details available." "Is that what happened?" She looked up at him. "No, sir. It isn't." Cross absorbed that without visible reaction, which was its own kind of reaction. "The missions those men were part of," she said, "the decisions that were made. Some of those decisions came from above my pay grade and were made for reasons that had nothing to do with the mission or the men. She stopped. And then the files got closed and the reasons stayed inside them. Who closed them? I don't know all the names. I know some of them. One of them has considerably more rank now than he did when the files were sealed. Cross was quiet for a full 5 seconds. Captain, he said, I want to be clear with you about what I'm hearing, because I want to be sure we're having the same conversation. Sir, you're telling me that soldiers died under circumstances that were covered rather than investigated, that their families were given false information, that the files were sealed with enough classification authority to delay even a flag officer's access request, and that at least one of the people responsible for sealing those files is currently serving in a senior capacity. She met his eyes. Yes, sir. The tent was very quiet. Why haven't you brought this forward before, Lon? He said. It wasn't accusatory. It was a genuine question, the kind that deserves a real answer. She took a breath. Because the last person who tried to bring it forward died in a vehicle accident 14 months after they started asking questions. She paused. The accident was ruled non-suspicious. Cross looked at her for a long time. I've been at Fort Carson for 3 years, she said, filing manifests, tracking equipment, staying below the level where anyone bothers to look. She stopped. Today was a mistake, I know that. I made it anyway. Cross walked to the tent entrance and looked out at the empty range. The firing benches stood pale in the fading light, and beyond them the desert stretched flat and enormous in every direction, the kind of landscape that made human problems look small without actually making them smaller. Get a room in the base housing block tonight, he said. Don't go back to Carson. Sir, I'm going to make some calls. Not from here. He turned back toward her. The window for doing this quietly. How short is it? Kane's contacts have his phone call on record. Whatever he learned about me in that conversation, it's already in more than one system. She stood. I'd say 24 hours before it moves somewhere you can't contain it. Maybe less. Cross nodded once. He picked up his phone and looked at it the way you look at a tool when you're making sure you've chosen the right one for the job. Go get your room, he said. I'll find you. She left the tent. The evening air hit her face, 15 degrees cooler than when she'd walked in, and the range was empty now. Equipment staged for morning, personnel dispersed. The benches stood silent under the sky, which had gone from amber to a deep settling blue at the horizon. She looked at them for a moment, those empty positions, and thought about the 13 men who'd shot from them today without solving the problem. She thought about the version of herself who'd walked across that gravel this morning with a clipboard and a maintenance request in 3 years of very deliberate ordinariness. That version felt like it belonged to someone else now. She was halfway to her truck when she saw Kane. He was at the far edge of the parking area beside the black SUV with government plates and no unit markings, and both of the civilian-adjacent men were in the vehicle now. Kane was leaning toward the driver's window, speaking low and fast, and his hands moved once in a gesture that said without saying it, "We don't have as much time as I thought." The driver handed him something. Kane looked at it. Whatever it was, a phone, a document, a photograph. He stared at it for 3 seconds and then put it inside his jacket, against his chest, with the specific care of a man handling something that changes things. He looked up. For a half second, across 50 meters of desert parking lot, in the last thin light of the Nevada evening, he looked directly at her. She didn't look away. She didn't change her pace. Kane straightened. He turned back to the driver and said 2 more words. Then the SUV pulled forward, and he stood watching it go. And when it turned out of the lot, she saw where it was headed. Not toward base housing, not toward the command facilities, not toward any of the standard destinations a vehicle with those plates should have had at the end of a range day. The main gate, off installation. She watched the taillights until the perimeter fence took them. Then she got in her truck and sat in the cooling cab and thought about the 4 men whose names she still carried. Donovan, Marsh, Ito, Reyes. The specific weights of specific people who had believed, in the last hours of their lives, that they were part of something that would be accounted for honestly when it was over. She thought about the files with their names in them, sealed under classification authorities that had been applied not to protect national security, but to protect the people who'd made the decisions that killed them. She thought about Donovan's wife, who had a daughter she'd never met because Donovan died before his child was born, and who had been told training accident and had been building a life on top of that false foundation for 9 years. She thought about what it would mean to open those files. Not for herself. She'd made her peace with what it would cost her personally about 3 minutes after the shot, standing next to her truck in the afternoon heat, with her hands doing the things she disliked. The cost to herself was a settled question. She thought about the families, the exposure, the grief that would have to be reconfigured around new facts that were worse in some ways and better in others. She thought about what Donovan would have wanted. She already knew the answer to that. She started the truck. The headlights came up across the empty lot, and in the rearview mirror the range lay still and dark behind the fence line. And somewhere inside the command facilities, General Cross was picking up a phone and starting to pull on a thread that 9 years of sealed files and careful institutional silence had been hoping no one would ever find. Evelyn put the truck in drive. She had a room to find, and about 20 hours before whatever Kane had just set in motion, arrived at a point where neither of them could slow it down. The base housing block at Blackstone was a single-story structure that had been built in the late 80s and updated approximately never, with cinder block walls painted the particular shade of institutional beige that suggested someone had once made a decision about color and then retired before anyone could ask them why. Evelyn's room was at the far end of the corridor, number 14, with a window that faced the perimeter fence, and beyond it, the open desert going dark under a sky that had cleared to a hard, starless black. She sat on the edge of the bed with her boots still on. The rifle case was on the floor beside the door. Her notebook was on the small desk. She'd put her phone on the nightstand and had been looking at it for the past few minutes with the specific quality of attention you give to something you're waiting on and don't entirely trust. Cross had said an hour. It had been 90 minutes. She wasn't worried about Cross. She was thinking about Kane's SUV and where it had gone and what the man in the driver's seat had handed him through the window, and she was running calculations that had nothing to do with wind or atmospheric density and everything to do with how much time she actually had before whatever Kane was building became something she couldn't work around. Her phone buzzed. Not Cross. A number she didn't recognize. Nevada area code. Last 4 digits she didn't have in any file. She looked at it for 2 full rings before answering. Hart. Captain. The voice was male, mid-40s, carrying the particular flatness of someone trained to deliver information without editorializing. My name is not important right now. What's important is that I have approximately 90 seconds before this call becomes a problem for both of us. Are you listening? Go ahead. Kane is not working alone. The contacts he met in the parking lot are connected to a congressional liaison office that has been managing the classification status of certain operational records for the past 7 years. They're not intelligence, they're political. The distinction matters because their timeline is different from an intelligence operations timeline, faster, less disciplined, more willing to create collateral damage. She stood up from the bed. Who are you? Someone who doesn't want to see those files stay closed. A pause of approximately 1 second. Donovan's team. I was support element. I didn't go into the canyon that day, but I was on the radio. She was quiet for a moment. What's Kane's next move? She said. He's going to request a formal administrative hold on your access to classified facilities pending the equipment inquiry. It's a procedural move, and he knows it'll be reversed, but it creates a window where your ability to coordinate with Cross is officially restricted. How long does a hold like that take to file? He's filing it tonight. It hits the system at 0600. She looked at her watch. 4 hours and 12 minutes. The men Kane met, she said. Names. The driver is a DoD contractor named Vasquez. The other one I don't have a clear ID on. Both of them have been connected to at least 2 previous situations where classified operational records became inconvenient and then quietly disappeared from accessible systems. She absorbed that. Disappeared how? Transferred to a classification tier that requires a specific committee authorization to access. By the time the authorization is obtained, the political window has closed and nobody's asking anymore. His voice dropped slightly. That's what they're going to do with your files. Not destroy them, just move them somewhere that requires 6 months of paperwork to see. She moved to the window. The perimeter fence was a dark line against slightly darker desert, and beyond it nothing but distance. Cross is making calls, she said. I know. That's the only reason I'm making this one. Another pause. Cross needs the file numbers, the specific designation strings for the operational records connected to your deployment, not the general classification tier, but the actual record identifiers. Without those, even a flag officer's request hits a wall. She knew where the identifiers were. She'd memorized them 11 years ago in a different country, under different circumstances, and she had not forgotten them because they were attached to names she also hadn't forgotten and couldn't have even if she'd tried. "I'll get them to cross," she said. "Do it before 0600. A brief pause. "There's something else. The soldier who died asking questions, 14 months after the fact. His name was Carver." She had not known his name. "He was JAG, the voice said. He'd been building a case file. What he had wasn't enough to move on its own, but combined with your operational records." He stopped. "His case file wasn't destroyed either. It was transferred. I know which tier." "Can you get it?" "Not from where I'm standing, but there's a records officer at the Pentagon Annex who owes me a significant personal debt and who has the access level." A pause. "She'll need a formal request from a flag officer with the right authorization chain. Cross can do it if he knows to ask." "I'll tell him, Captain." His voice had shifted slightly, the practiced flatness softening by maybe 5%, which on a voice like his was audible. "Donovan used to talk about you, after on bar. He didn't say your name, he didn't have your name, but he described the shooter. He said whoever it was had saved 7 men and would probably never know whether any of them amounted to anything worth saving." She pressed her palm flat against the cold cinder block wall. "He amounted to something," she said. "Donovan. He was good at his job and he understood what he was doing and he made the decisions he made because he believed in what he was part of. That matters, regardless of what happened after." The line was quiet for 3 seconds. "Yes, ma'am," the voice said. And then the call ended. She stood at the window for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and called Cross. He answered on the first ring. "Hart, I need to see you now, sir." "In person, not on the phone." A 2-second pause. 10 minutes. Range Administration Building, side entrance." She pulled on her jacket, picked up her notebook, and left the room. The night air was cold in the way Nevada nights are cold, fast and complete, the temperature dropping as if the desert simply lost interest in being warm the moment the sun was gone. She crossed the housing area at a pace between a walk and something more purposeful, the gravel loud under her boots, the installation around her quiet, except for the distant sound of generators running the perimeter lighting. Cross was already at the side entrance when she arrived. He was alone, no Aldrich, no aide, just himself in his uniform with his phone in his hand and the expression of a man who had spent the last 90 minutes making calls and had arrived at a state of controlled urgency. "Talk," he said. She talked. She gave him everything from the call, Vasquez, the congressional liaison connection, the administrative hold filing at 0600, the record transfer mechanism they were planning to use. She gave him the Carver information. She gave him the file identifiers, all 7 of them, recited from memory and sequence, and watched Cross write them into his phone with the speed of a man who recognized the value of what he was receiving. When she finished, he looked up from the phone. "You memorized those identifiers?" "Yes, sir. 11 years ago." "Yes." He looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the command tent, not evaluating exactly, something closer to recalibrating. "The Carver case file. If I submit the request to the Pentagon Annex Records Officer tonight, does it get pulled before Kane's hold hits the system?" "Depends on the officer," she said. "The person who can access it. She was described to me as someone who will move if she has reason to. The request needs to come from you specifically with your authorization chain, and it needs to arrive before the record identifier gets flagged by whatever Kane's contacts are planning to use." "When does the flag hit?" "I don't know exactly. Probably simultaneous with the administrative hold. 0600 or earlier." Cross did the same calculation she'd already done. He looked at his watch. She couldn't see the face, but she knew what it said. "All right," he said. He typed something into his phone. "I'm sending the records request now through a channel that predates Kane's contacts by about 8 years. The officer at the annex should have it within 20 minutes. He looked up. "If she pulls the file, it comes to me directly. Kane doesn't see it." "And the operational records, the 7 identifiers." I'm submitting a flag officer access request through the SOCOM chain. It'll take longer, probably morning, but the submission timestamp is what matters. Once I've submitted, any attempt to transfer those records to a higher classification tier has to go through a contested access process, which buys time. She nodded. She was thinking about the administrative hold. The hold cane is filing, she said. If it restricts my access before you have the records, then you're not the one accessing them. I am. He put his phone in his pocket. You don't need to be in this building or on this installation for me to pull records, Captain. What I needed from you were the identifiers. I have them. He paused. Go back to your room. Stay off your personal phone. Use the landline in the housing unit if you need to reach me. And stay on base. Yes, sir. He looked at her for a moment longer than the operational conversation required. Donovan, he said. Was he? He was good, she said. He was one of the best I worked with. Cross nodded once. He turned back toward the administration building entrance. Sir, he stopped. The person who told me about Vasquez and the hold. He was support element on the on-bar operation. He was on the radio. Cross was quiet for a moment. He took a risk making that call, she said. I know, Cross said. And he went inside, mad. She made it back to her room at 2240. She didn't sleep. She sat in the desk chair with the notebook open to a blank page and a pen in her hand, and she didn't write anything. She thought about Donovan and Marsh and Ito and Reyes, and she thought about the decisions made above their heads by people who had weighed their lives against other considerations and found the math acceptable. She thought about Donovan's daughter, who was 9 years old and had never met her father and had been building an understanding of who he was from a story that wasn't true. At some point after midnight, she became aware that she was hearing something. Not inside the building, outside, the perimeter, near the fence line her window faced. A sound that didn't fit the pattern of the installation at rest. She went to the window without turning on a light and looked out. A vehicle, not moving, parked at the edge of the service road that ran along the inside of the perimeter fence, approximately 80 meters from her window. No headlights. Engine probably off. She couldn't see whether anyone was in it from this distance and in this light. She watched it for 4 minutes. The vehicle didn't move. Nobody got out. She moved away from the window, sat back in the chair, and picked up the landline handset. She dialed the number Cross had given her. It rang 3 times. He picked up. Vehicle on the interior service road, she said. North side near housing block. Lights off. A pause. How long? At least 4 minutes before I called, probably longer. Stay in the room. She heard him moving, the sound of someone getting up quickly and making it look considered. Don't open the door for anyone who doesn't identify themselves as base security with my authorization. The line went quiet, but he didn't hang up. She could hear ambient sound on his end. Interior, the low hum of equipment running. 8 minutes passed. Then, from outside, she heard a vehicle start. She went back to the window in time to see headlights come on. Not the parked vehicle, a second one she hadn't clocked, coming from the direction of the main administrative area. Security. Moving toward the service road. The first vehicle's engine turned over. It pulled away from the fence and moved toward the gate, and the security vehicle followed at a distance. And for 90 seconds there was the low interplay of headlights on the perimeter road before both vehicles disappeared from her line of sight. Captain. Cross's voice in her ear. I see it. Base security is logging the vehicle. It had no authorization to be on that road. A pause. It was a rental. Enterprise plate. She thought about Vasquez. About the man in the passenger seat whose name the voice on the phone hadn't known. About Kane, who was somewhere on or near this installation tonight doing whatever the next part of his plan required. Sir, she said, they're not going to wait for 0600. Cross was quiet for 2 seconds. No, he said. I don't think they are either. He told her to stay put. She told him she would. She meant it, mostly. Staying put was the correct tactical choice, given that he was the one with the access and the authorization chain and the flag rank that made all of it operable. She was the person with the identifiers and the history and the knowledge of what the files contained, and that made her useful in a specific way and vulnerable in a specific way, and the two things were not separable. She sat back in the chair. At 0140, the landline rang. The Carver file, Cross said, without preamble. My contact at the annex pulled it. She had it in accessible storage, not the transfer tier. Kane's people hadn't moved it yet. Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment. What's in it? She said. I've read the summary. Carver was building a case around the decision chain that authorized the fourth operation, the one where your team took casualties. He had communications, not smoking gun material on its own, but corroborating. He'd identified 2 senior officials by name. A pause. One of them is currently a deputy undersecretary. She absorbed that. The other one, Cross said, retired from the Army 4 years ago. He's now a lobbyist for a defense contractor that has ongoing classified contracts with 3 of the facilities connected to your original operational record. Kane, she said. Kane worked for him. Early in Kane's career before Kane moved up through SOCOM. 3 years, personnel management and special projects. Cross's voice was flat with the specific flatness of a man who has just confirmed something he'd hoped wasn't true. Kane isn't protecting the system, Captain. He's protecting a specific person. She thought about the phone call Kane had made right after her shot. The speed of the response. The 2 men in the parking lot within 20 minutes of a range evolution on a remote Nevada installation. He didn't pull her name from a database, she said. He called someone who already had the file pulled, which means someone was already watching for movement on those records. Cross paused. You've been at Carson for 3 years. Have you done anything in the past 6 months that might have flagged a watch system? She thought carefully. No, nothing active. A pause. I filed a records inquiry 14 months ago. Routine format, inquiring about the status of service documentation for deceased personnel. I used a cover request. I framed it as a logistics audit. It shouldn't have been visible. 14 months ago, Cross said. The timing settled into place for both of them at the same moment. That's when Carver died, she said. The line was quiet. Someone read your inquiry, Cross said, even through the cover framing, and they've been watching your record since. She stood up. She needed to move. Sitting in the chair was no longer something her body was willing to cooperate with. Sir, she said, what are you going to do with the Carver file? It's already been transmitted to the SOCOM Inspector General with a flag officer referral notation. That process is now formally open. Kane cannot close it. A brief pause. And the 7 operational record identifiers. My access request was acknowledged 40 minutes ago. The records are flagged for flag officer review. Any attempt to transfer them to a higher classification tier now goes through a formal contested access hearing. She stopped moving. It had happened. The thing she'd understood was possible when she walked back to the range with her rifle case and stood at the rope line and asked for one shot. The thing that had been sitting at the bottom of everything she'd done in the 4 years since she set the case under the canvas tarp. It had moved from the domain of possible into the domain of actual, and the feeling it produced was not relief exactly. It was closer to the feeling of a load-bearing structure that has been under tension for a very long time, finally transferring its weight to a foundation designed to hold it. It hurt a little. That was the part people didn't talk about. The men Kane is working for, she said. When the IG opens the operational records, their names will be visible, Cross said. Yes. They'll move. Fast. I know. That's why the Carver file went out tonight, not in the morning. His voice had the quality it had on the range. Not soft, not hard, simply factual about the situation. I've also contacted 2 members of the Senate Armed Services Committee, staffers I trust. They've been informed that a flag officer review of certain sealed operational records is underway and that there may be attempts to obstruct the process. She sat back down on the bed. You moved faster than I expected, she said. You told me the window was 20 hours. I assumed you were being optimistic. A short pause. Try to get some sleep. Tomorrow is going to require you to be functional. What happens tomorrow? At 0800, I'm convening a formal review board here at Blackstone to assess the results of the marksmanship evaluation. All personnel who participated, including you, Kane, will be present. That's the evaluation board. Yes, but the agenda also includes a briefing from the JAG office on the status of Kane's equipment inquiry. A pause. Which will be resolved in approximately 4 minutes when the JAG officer confirms that my verbal authorization superseded the equipment list. and then the record of today's range evolution will be formally certified. She understood what he was doing. The review board was a public moment, official, documented, attended by every person who'd been on that range today. Whatever Kane had planned as the next move, he was going to have to make it in that room, in front of those people, with a formally convened general officer board in session. It was a good move. "He'll have something," she said. "He won't walk in there empty." "No," Cross agreed. "He won't, which is why I want you rested." She lay back on the bed without taking her boots off, which was a habit from a long time ago that she'd never entirely broken, and she stared at the ceiling of the room and listened to the installation settle into its nighttime rhythms around her. She thought about the shot, not the mechanics of it. She'd stopped thinking about the mechanics within 90 seconds of firing, which was its own kind of habit. She thought about the moment before it, the 12 minutes of waiting after her calculations were complete, lying behind a rifle that knew her better than most people did, watching the desert breathe. The way everything narrowed down in those minutes to the simplest possible version of the situation, a problem, a solution, the distance between them. She'd spent 4 years making her life too small to cause problems. She'd spent one afternoon taking a shot that couldn't be unfired. She thought about Donovan's voice, which she could still hear precisely, the specific register of it in a radio headset on a night when radio clarity was the difference between people living and not. She thought about Marsh, who used to hum to himself during static surveillance because silence made him anxious, and he'd never found a way to make peace with it. Ito, who kept a photograph of his mother in a waterproof sleeve in his chest rig and had never, as far as she knew, explained to anyone why it was there. Reyes, who was the youngest of them and had the most natural understanding of ballistics she'd encountered before or since, who could read a range almost as fast as she could. Reyes had been 26. She hadn't let herself think about Reyes in a long time. She let herself now, in the dark of room 14 at Blackstone, with the desert outside the window and somewhere across the installation, a general officer making calls that were going to change several things that had been settled for 9 years. Reyes had deserved better. All 4 of them had. And the people responsible for what they got instead had been living very comfortably for 9 years on the assumption that no one was ever going to force them to account for it. She closed her eyes. At 0550, she was awake and dressed. At 0558, her landline rang. She picked it up. "Hart." "It's Rourke," the DevGru operator's voice without preamble. "I'm in the corridor outside your room. I need you to open the door." She stood still for a moment. "Why are you in this corridor, Sergeant?" "Because Kane has been in the range administration building for the past 20 minutes with the base commander and a civilian I've never seen before. And they're not talking about the equipment inquiry." A short pause. "And because I've been thinking about your rifle since yesterday afternoon, and I know what modified feed geometry in a 338 Lapua means about where that rifle has been used, and I'd like to have a conversation before whatever happens this morning." She looked at the door. "1 second," she said. She opened it. Rourke looked like a man who hadn't slept, which matched how he looked like a man who wouldn't be slowed down by not sleeping. He was in uniform, rifle not present, hands visible and empty, and he was looking at her with the direct, uncomplicated attention of someone who has made a decision and wants to see if the person they've brought it to is worth having made it for. "Anbar Valley," he said, 9 years ago. I was third element. We didn't make it to the canyon. We were the QRF that held position while the primary team extracted." He paused. "I heard the shots on the radio. 3 of them. Spaced, controlled, like someone working a math problem." He looked at her steadily. "I've spent 9 years wondering." She held his gaze. "Come in," she said. He came in. She closed the door. "What I'm about to tell you," she said, "you can't be uninformed of afterward." "Understood." "And what you know about this morning, Kane, the civilian, what you heard, I need all of it." "That's why I'm here," Rourke said. "The civilian with Kane. I got close enough to hear part of it before they moved the conversation inside." He sat in the desk chair leaning forward with his forearms on his knees. He said, "The board this morning is a problem, but not if she doesn't show up to it." The room was quiet. "He didn't mean it as a threat to my safety," she said. It wasn't a question. She was working through it. "No, he meant it procedurally. If you're not present for the 0800 board, Cross can't formally certify the shot on the record. The evaluation result stays provisional. Kane's equipment inquiry stays active. Rourke looked at her. They're going to file the administrative hold early, before 6. It may have already gone in. She checked her watch. 0603. She picked up the landline and dialed Cross. It rang once. I know, Cross said. The hold filed at 0559. I'm contesting it now. How long does the contest take? Under normal circumstances, 2 to 4 hours. A pause with something compressed in it. I'm not using normal circumstances. Kane is in the base administration building with a civilian, sir. A silence of about 2 seconds. Description of the civilian. She looked at Rourke. He gave a quick description. Late 50s, civilian business attire, gray hair trimmed short, a particular way of standing that suggested he was accustomed to being the most senior person in any given room. She relayed it. Cross was quiet for 4 full seconds. When he spoke again, his voice had changed in a way she registered but couldn't immediately name. Something pulled tighter. That description matches a man named Hargrove, he said. Raymond Hargrove, former Army, currently a principal at a defense advisory firm in Arlington. A pause. He was the deputy operations director for the command structure that authorized your 4th deployment. She sat down on the bed. Hargrove, one of the 2 names in Carver's file. He was here on the installation, in the administration building with Kane at 6 in the morning. Sir, she said, he came here personally. Yes, Cross said, he did. That's not a bureaucratic move. That's not paperwork and classification tiers and congressional liaisons. She stopped. He's here because something in the timeline moved faster than he expected, and he decided he needed to be in the room. Agreed. Which means he thinks there's still something he can control if he's physically present. Also agreed. Sir, what can he actually do? Legally, procedurally, what options does he have at this point? Cross was quiet for a moment. He can attempt to invoke national security emergency provisions to stay the IG referral. It requires a specific certification, and it has to be filed within a particular window. He would know that window. Does he have standing to file it? His current role is civilian advisory. He doesn't have direct standing, but he has connections to 2 committee chairs who do. A pause. If he makes those calls in the next 2 hours, it becomes a political process, not a military one. And in a political process, the timeline extends significantly. She understood. Extend the timeline, and the names in those files stayed protected long enough for other mechanisms to engage, long enough for the personnel connected to the records to position themselves, long enough for Carver's file to be reclassified through a committee process, long enough for her to become a logistics officer who'd taken an unauthorized shot at a range evaluation and been placed on administrative hold for her trouble. Sir, she said, I need to be at that board. The hold! Contest it to whatever level you can reach in the next 90 minutes. I'll handle the rest. She looked at Rourke. He was watching her with the quality of attention of a man who has been in enough situations to know when a situation is moving from its pre-phase to its active phase. I have Sergeant Rourke. I need to know if there are other shooters from yesterday who you'd consider reliable. A pause. Reliable how? Reliable in the sense of men who will be where they're supposed to be at 0800, regardless of what administrative complications appear between now and then. Cross was quiet for a moment. Rourke you have. D'Souza, the Delta Sergeant, position 6 on the firing line yesterday. And my aide, Major Aldrich. Those 3 I'd put in that category without hesitation. That's enough, she said. Captain? His voice had something in it she hadn't heard from him before. Not quite concern, something more specific than that. Whatever you're planning, I'm going to the board, sir, she said. That's all. She hung up. She looked at Rourke. How much of that did you follow? She said. Enough. He stood. D'Souza is already awake. He saw the rental vehicle on the perimeter road last night, and he's been sitting on it since. He paused. What do you need? She looked at the desk. The notebook was open to the page she'd never written on. She picked up the pen and wrote 4 names, and she looked at them for a moment, and then she closed the notebook. I need to get to that boardroom, she said, and I need Kane to be there when I do. Rourke nodded once. Then let's go, he said. She picked up her jacket. She did not pick up the rifle case. This part of it was not going to be decided by anything that came out of that case. She went to the door, and Rourke stepped out into the corridor ahead of her, and the morning air in the hallway was cold and smelled of industrial floor cleaner and the particular staleness of a building that had been housing tired people for a long time. She thought briefly of Hargrove in the administration building, a man who had sat in a room 9 years ago and made calculations about acceptable losses and had signed something or said something or simply nodded and had lived with that so comfortably for so long that he'd had to be physically present on a Nevada installation at 6 in the morning to protect it. She walked down the corridor. The morning was coming. The board was at 8. And between now and then, Raymond Hargrove was going to learn what Victor Kane had already partially understood the day before, that the situation he'd come here to manage had already moved past the point where his presence could contain it. The corridor outside room 14 was 40 feet long and ended in a fire door that opened onto the housing block's east side parking area. Rourke went through first, checked the angles without making it look like he was checking, and held the door while Evelyn came through behind him. The sky was the specific dark blue of early morning in the desert. Not black anymore, not yet gray, the color of something that hasn't committed to its next state. The air was cold enough that she could see her breath in thin, brief puffs. Across the installation, the lights of the administration building were on, and she could see 2 vehicles in the lot outside it that hadn't been there the night before. "Aldrich is meeting us at the side entrance to the main conference facility," Rourke said, moving beside her, keeping his voice low out of habit rather than necessity. "D'Souza is coming from the East Billets, 3 minutes out. Kane will know I'm moving. Probably. But knowing and stopping are different things." They walked fast across the hardpan. The installation had the particular quiet of a place that is awake but not yet fully operational. Generators running, lights on, the first personnel moving between buildings with the focused, head-down pace of people with early duties and no patience for diversion. Major Aldrich was at the side entrance. He was a lean man in his mid-30s with the look of someone who slept light and woke clean, which this morning was an advantage. He had a tablet in his hand and a tightness around his jaw that indicated he'd been in contact with Cross and had been told things he was still processing. "Captain Hart," he said, "the General's contest to the administrative hold was filed at 0607. We're waiting on a response from the Personnel Command Duty Officer." He paused. "We may not have it before 8. "Can the board convene with the hold active?" she said. "Technically, the hold restricts your access to classified facilities and information. The conference room is unclassified. The evaluation documentation filed yesterday is also currently at an unclassified level." He said it in the tone of someone who has found a specific gap in a set of regulations and is not entirely sure it will hold weight under pressure. "The General's position is that nothing in the hold language prevents your physical attendance at a formal review board. Kane's position will be different. Kane's position will be whatever is most useful to Kane in the moment," Aldrich said. "Yes." D'Souza arrived from the east, a compact, deliberate-moving man with sergeant major's rank and a face that had done considerable mileage. He fell in beside them, without ceremony. "2 base security personnel entered the administration building at 0540, he said, apparently continuing a conversation he'd been having with himself. Not standard rotation. They were directed in, not walking a route. "Hargrove," Evelyn said. "That's the working assumption." D'Souza glanced at her. "You know who he is?" "I know what he did." D'Souza held her gaze for a moment. Whatever he saw there was apparently sufficient because he nodded and looked forward again. They went in through the side entrance. MAC. The Blackstone main conference facility was a low rectangular building that had been built for exactly this kind of purpose. Formal review boards, evaluation assessments, the particular theater of military decision-making that required a table long enough to seat 12 people and a projection system old enough to have compatibility issues with anything manufactured in the last 4 years. The main room had 16 chairs arranged around the table, a whiteboard on one wall, and a window on the north side that faced the range. When Evelyn walked in at 0722, 6 people were already present. 3 of them she knew: General Cross at the head of the table, Kane to Cross's left, and a JAG captain named Flores, who she recognized from the range the previous afternoon. The other 3 she placed quickly. 2 were evaluation staff, range officers who'd been on duty during the 12 misses. The third was a man she hadn't seen before, sitting at the far end of the table with the stillness of someone who has been in rooms like this more times than he can count, and has learned that stillness communicates authority faster than movement does. Raymond Hargrove. Late 50s, exactly as Rourke had described him. Gray hair, civilian suit, the kind of physical presence that comes not from size, but from years of occupying positions where other people waited for you to speak. He was looking at the whiteboard when she entered, and he turned toward the door at exactly the moment it opened, which told her he'd been tracking the entrance from his peripheral vision and had been waiting. He looked at her the way you look at a problem you've managed before and expect to manage again. She sat down. Rourke and D'Souza took chairs along the wall, not at the table, which would have required formal board membership, but in the observer positions that were standard in any review room. Aldrich sat 2 chairs down from Cross. Kane had not looked at her directly since she walked in. He was reviewing something on his tablet with the focused performance of a man who is deliberately not reacting to something. Cross looked at Evelyn once, a brief, direct look that carried a specific message. He'd read it. He knew what they were walking into. He was ready. "We'll begin," Cross said. His voice in the conference room had a different quality than it had in the tent the night before. More formal, more contained, the voice of someone activating a particular mode of authority. "This is the formal review board for the Blackstone Advanced Marksmanship Evaluation, convened 0800 July 16th. I'm presiding as senior officer for the evaluation program." He looked at Flores. "Captain Flores, begin with the equipment inquiry." Flores opened his binder. "Yes, sir. The inquiry filed by Colonel Kane regarding Captain Hart's use of an unregistered weapon during yesterday's evaluation. Having reviewed the range safety protocols applicable to this evolution and the verbal authorization provided by General Cross at approximately 1340 hours, it is the JAG office's finding that the verbal authorization of the senior officer present supersedes the pre-filed equipment list under AR 385-63, paragraph 4.7. Captain Hart's participation and the result of her shot are within procedural bounds." He closed the binder. "The inquiry is resolved. The shot stands." Kane set his tablet down. "With respect," he said, and his voice had the precise, calibrated quality of a man who has decided on his approach and intends to execute it. "The JAG finding addresses the procedural question. It doesn't address the security question." Cross looked at him. "Elaborate." "Captain Hart's weapon is not registered in any accessible military inventory. The platform she used incorporates modifications that would typically indicate specialized military application. The question of where that weapon originated and under what program it was built is, in my view, a legitimate security matter that this board should address before certifying any result connected to it." He paused. "I'd also note that Captain Hart's service record carries a classification hold that, in my reading, suggests her background may not be consistent with her current assignment." Cross said nothing. At the far end of the table, Hargrove stirred slightly. Just a shift in weight, barely visible. But she was watching him and she caught it. "Colonel Kane," Evelyn said. Kane turned his head toward her with the measured pace of a man deciding how much attention to grant. "The weapon is mine," she said. "Personally owned, legally acquired, and modified under my own certification. If you want the gunsmithing documentation, I can produce it." She held his gaze. "What you're describing as a security question is a background question. And if you want to open my background in this room, I'd encourage you to consider that the same process that opens it will also open the operational records attached to it." The room was quiet. Kane's expression didn't change visibly, but something in his posture adjusted. A small, involuntary compression, the physical equivalent of a reassessment. Hargrove spoke for the first time. "General Cross," he said. His voice was measured, deep, carrying the practiced reasonableness of someone who has spent decades in rooms where reasonableness is currency. "I wonder if we might table the certification question briefly. I've come a considerable distance to speak with this board, and I think there's context that would be useful to the record." Cross looked at him the way you look at something you've identified and have been waiting for. "Mr. Hargrove, you were introduced to me this morning as a DOD advisory consultant, You're not a member of this board, and your presence in this room was not requested by me. Would you like to explain your interest in this evaluation?" Hargrove smiled in the way of someone who has anticipated this question. "Of course. I have an ongoing advisory relationship with the Special Operations training community that makes the results of this evaluation relevant to certain planning processes I'm engaged in, entirely routine." He paused. "I also have some familiarity with the classification concerns Colonel Kane has raised, and I thought it might be helpful to clarify them directly." "Helpful to whom?" Rourke said from the wall. Everyone looked at him. Rourke was sitting with his arms folded and his feet flat on the floor, and the expression of a man who asked a sincere question and would like a sincere answer. Hargrove looked at Rourke with the slight recalibration of a man who hadn't expected to need to manage that direction. "I'm sorry, Sergeant. Rourke?" And I asked who it would be helpful to. "To the board," Hargrove said. "Because from where I'm sitting," Rourke said, "you drove to a remote Nevada installation before sunrise to attend a marksmanship evaluation board that you weren't invited to. That's not routine advisory work. That's something else." A brief silence. Hargrove's smile remained in place, which was its own kind of answer. Cross said, "Mr. Hargrove, I'm going to ask you to step outside while this board conducts its formal business. If there's something you'd like to add to the record, we can address that in a separate session." Hargrove did not move immediately. He looked at the table, at his own hands, with the expression of a man performing a calculation and arriving at a result he doesn't love but can work with. "General," he said, "I'd like to note for the record that there are national security considerations connected to certain personnel files that, if opened without appropriate framework, could compromise active operational security." "Noted," Cross said. "Step outside." Hargrove stood. He was unhurried about it, which was itself a message. "I am leaving because I choose to, not because you have moved me." He buttoned his jacket. He looked at Evelyn once, briefly, the way you look at something you intend to return to. Then he walked out of the room. The door closed. Cross looked at Kane. "Victor, is there anything else you'd like to raise procedurally before we certify the result?" Kane was quiet for 3 seconds. Evelyn watched him and understood what was happening inside those 3 seconds. The specific internal negotiation of a man who has built a strategy around several pillars and has just watched 2 of them pulled out. He was reassessing what he had left and whether it was enough to accomplish anything. "No, sir," he said. "Then the board certifies the result. Captain Hart's shot is formally entered into the evaluation record as a confirmed hit, 4,000 meters, within 2 inches of point of aim, July 15th, Blackstone Proving Grounds." Cross looked at Flores, who wrote in the binder. "That concludes the evaluation portion of this board." He set his hands flat on the table. "We're going to move now to a separate matter." Kane looked up. "The operational records connected to Captain Hart's service prior to Fort Carson have been flagged for flag officer review under a formal SOCOM IG referral filed at 0150 this morning," Cross said. "The referral concerns the decision chain that authorized a series of classified operations between 11 and 9 years ago, and the circumstances under which personnel casualties during those operations were reported to families." He looked at Kane steadily. "I'm also in receipt of a case file compiled by a JAG officer named Carver, who was investigating the same decision chain before his death 14 months ago." The room's quality of silence had shifted. The range officers were very still. Flores had stopped writing. Kane said, "Sir, those records are sealed under—" "I'm aware of their classification status. I'm also aware that the flag officer access request I submitted last night has been acknowledged, which means the records are now under contested access review and cannot be transferred or reclassified during the pendency of that review." Cross held Kane's gaze. "So they're going to be opened. The question before us now is what we do in this room today with what we know." Kane looked at his tablet. He looked at the table. He looked at the window, briefly, where the morning light was coming in at a low angle and hitting the near edge of the whiteboard. He looked like a man doing arithmetic on a problem whose answer he already knows but doesn't want to accept. "Captain Hart," Cross said, "I'd like you to brief this board on the operational context that those records contain, as much as you're able to provide in this setting." She had thought about this. She had thought about it in room 14 while she was not sleeping, and she had thought about it walking across the installation in the cold early morning and she had thought about it in the 30 seconds between walking through the conference room door and sitting down. She had thought about what it would feel like to say these things aloud, in a room with a table and chairs and a window, to people who would write things in binders. It felt, she discovered, like setting something down that you've been carrying so long you'd stop noticing the weight, except as a permanent condition of your body. Between 11 and 8 years ago, she said, I participated in 6 classified operations under a program that I understood to be authorized through standard special operations channels. The program involved precision long-range interdiction in contested territories. No team larger than 6 personnel. Minimal footprint. No support infrastructure. Extract on completion. She kept her voice even. I was the primary shooter on 5 of the 6 operations. The 6th was the operation in Anbar Valley, where General Cross's unit was pinned down. I was providing overwatch support. She looked at Cross when she said it. He didn't look away. The 4th operation was when we took casualties, she said. There were 6 of us. Donovan, Marsh, Ito, Reyes, a logistics specialist named Farrow, and me. We were inserted into a position based on intelligence that had been assessed as confirmed. When we arrived at the designated position, the intelligence was wrong. The location had been compromised, and we were in contact within 4 minutes of insertion. She stopped. The room waited. Donovan, Marsh, Ito, and Reyes were killed in the engagement, she said. Farrow and I extracted under contact. The extraction itself took 6 hours, and I won't go into the details of that in this setting. What happened after the extraction? Cross said. We were debriefed separately. I was told the operation had been assessed as a training incident for reporting purposes. The families of the 4 men would be notified of a training accident. She paused. I was told that the intelligence failure had been reviewed and that appropriate corrections were being made to the oversight process. Who told you this? My program coordinator, a colonel at the time. I don't know his current rank or status. She looked at the table. I later understood through sources I'm not going to identify in this room that the intelligence failure wasn't a failure. The position had been compromised deliberately as part of a separate operation being run by a different command element that was unaware of our presence at that location. The room was very still. Deliberately, D'Souza said from the wall. He said it quietly, without inflection, the way you say a word when you want to make sure you've heard it correctly. That's my understanding, she said. I can't prove the intent. What I can tell you is that the intelligence used to authorize our insertion had been flagged as potentially compromised 48 hours prior to the operation, and that flag was not passed to our team. Who received the flag? Cross said. She looked at him. The deputy operations director for the command structure that authorized the deployment. Cross was quiet for a moment. Hargrove, he said. It wasn't a question. She answered it anyway. Yes, sir. Kane had not spoken. He was sitting with both hands flat on the table and his eyes at approximately the level of the middle distance. And he had the look of a man who has been told a story he either knew already or suspected and is now deciding in real time what that means about his position. Colonel Kane, Cross said. Kane looked at him. What is your relationship with Raymond Hargrove? A pause of 4 seconds, long enough to be a real pause, not a processing pause. He was my superior officer early in my career, personnel management and special projects, 3 years. Have you been in contact with him regarding Captain Hart's service record? Sir, Victor, I'm asking you directly. Kane looked at the table. Then he looked at Cross. He contacted me 2 weeks ago. He said there was a possibility that an operational record connected to a former program might surface through routine audit processes and asked me to monitor for any access requests connected to that record. Did he give you a reason? He said it was connected to an ongoing national security review that required careful management. And when Captain Hart took the shot yesterday, I called him. Kane's voice had lost its managed quality. It sounded now like a man talking, not a colonel briefing. I didn't know who she was. I knew there was a name on a watch list, and I had a face in front of me, and I called to see if they were the same person. Were you aware, Cross said, of the circumstances of the 4th operation? The compromised intelligence? The 4 casualties? Kane looked at him for a long moment. Not specifically, he said. No, Cross held his gaze. But you knew the records were sensitive. I knew they were classified. That's not what I asked. Another long pause. Yes, sir, I knew they were sensitive. The room absorbed that. Flores was writing steadily. The range officers had the expressions of men who had come to a routine evaluation board and were now in the middle of something categorically different, and were managing this with the discipline of people who understand that their job in this moment is to witness accurately and say nothing. Evelyn looked at Kane. He was not a monster. She had worked that out sometime in the night. He was a man who had done a series of small things that, assembled over time, had put him in the position of protecting something that deserved to be exposed. The distinction mattered to her, though she wasn't entirely sure why. Maybe because Donovan had been straightforward, and Marsh had hummed to himself in the dark, and Reyes had been 26 years old with a natural gift for reading ranges, and none of them had been complicated in the way that led to what happened to them. They deserved a story that was complicated about the right things. I want to talk about the families, she said. Cross looked at her. Donovan had a daughter, she said. She was born 4 months after he died. She's 9 years old. Her mother has been living for 9 years with a story about a training accident, and that story is the foundation under everything she's built since. She stopped. I want to know what this process looks like for her. For all 4 families. Cross was quiet for a moment. The IG process will include formal next of kin notification. It's done through a dedicated casualty affairs office with support personnel. It's not done by filing a report. How long does that process take? Once the records are formally opened and reviewed, notification is typically coordinated within 30 to 60 days. I want to be part of that process, she said. Not officially, not through channels. I want to be available to those families if they want to speak to someone who was there. Cross looked at her for a moment. That's not a standard request. No, sir. He nodded once. I'll see what can be arranged. Kane said, Sir, what happens now, to me? Cross looked at him. You're going to provide a full written account of your contact with Hargrove, the specific instructions he gave you, and every action you took in connection with those instructions. Starting this morning, you'll be placed on administrative review pending the IG investigation. Kane nodded. He looked like a man receiving a sentence he'd known was coming. Not relieved, not destroyed, just absorbing. Sir, he said. For what it's worth, right now, Cross said, it's not worth very much. Later, depending on what you provide and how completely you provide it, the assessment may change. He let that sit. You can start with Hargrove, everything you know about what he's been managing and why. Kane picked up his pen. Outside in the corridor, Hargrove was presumably still waiting. Evelyn thought about that. A man who had traveled from Arlington to a remote Nevada installation at 5 in the morning to contain a problem that had just expanded in the past 45 minutes, well beyond the reach of anything he could now contain. She thought about the specific quality of that realization when it arrived. She thought about Carver, who had died in a vehicle accident 14 months after he'd started asking questions, and whose file had been in accessible storage at a Pentagon annex because someone who owed a debt to a voice on a phone had not moved it when asked. Small things. The whole architecture of it was built from small things, small decisions, small corruptions, small accommodations, accumulated into something that had crushed 4 people and left their families with a lie for a foundation. She thought about Reyes at 26, who could read a range like he'd been born knowing how. D'Souza appeared at her elbow. She hadn't seen him move, like he'd come off the wall quietly, which for a man his size was its own kind of skill. He put a coffee cup on the table in front of her, black, which she hadn't asked for and hadn't known she needed until it was there. She looked at him. Donovan, he said quietly. I knew him. Not well. We ran an op together in 14. Good man. Yes, she said. He was. D'Souza went back to the wall. She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. It was too hot to drink yet, but the warmth was useful regardless. Cross was on his phone, speaking in the clipped shorthand of someone coordinating with multiple parties who all need different things. Aldrich was typing on his tablet. Flores had finished his notes and was reviewing them with the care of a man who understands that what he's written will matter. At 0847, the conference room door opened. Not Hargrove, a base security sergeant, presenting himself at the threshold with the posture of a man who has information his superior needs immediately. General Cross, the sergeant said, Mr. Hargrove is requesting to speak with you directly before— Tell him to wait, Cross said, without looking up from his phone. The sergeant withdrew. At 09:03, Cross ended his call and set his phone on the table. He looked at the room, at Kane, still writing, at Flores, reviewing, at Aldrich, coordinating, at Rourke and D'Souza along the wall, at Evelyn with her hands around the coffee cup. The SOCOM IG has formally accepted the referral, Cross said. The 7 operational records are under active review. Contested access is in effect. He paused. The Personnel Command Duty Officer has resolved the administrative hold. As of 0850, it's been withdrawn. The room was quiet. Captain Hart, Cross said, your record is no longer under any active hold or inquiry. She looked at the table. She thought she would feel something different than what she felt, which was primarily tired. Not the tired of insufficient sleep, but the tired of something that has been under continuous tension finally going slack. Thank you, sir, she said. Don't thank me. He looked at her steadily. This isn't over. The IG process takes months. Hargrove has resources and he'll use them. Kane's testimony, when it's complete, will complicate things for several people who are currently comfortable, and those people will respond. He paused. What happened yesterday on that range is now part of a documented federal investigation record, which means it's also permanent. Nothing that comes next can undo it. She understood. He wasn't reassuring her. He was briefing her. There's one more thing, Cross said. He picked up his phone and found something on the screen and turned it toward her. The Pentagon Annex Records officer who pulled Carver's file last night. She included something in the transmission that wasn't part of the case file itself. He held the phone so she could read. It was a scanned photograph, black and white, slightly degraded, the image quality of something that had been printed and rescanned multiple times. It showed 6 people in field gear in a desert location she recognized, standing in the loose grouping of people who've just come off a successful operation and haven't fully re-inhabited their bodies yet. She was on the left. She'd forgotten she was ever that young. Donovan was in the center, grinning, which was characteristic of him. He grinned after things, never before. Marsh and Ito and Reyes and Farrow were spread across the frame. Carver had this in his file, Cross said. He'd gotten it from somewhere. I don't know how. He paused. I thought you should see it. She looked at it for a long moment. 6 people standing in a desert, existing in the 30 seconds after something difficult was over and before anyone knew what came next. She handed the phone back. Keep it in the record, she said, all 6 of us. Cross looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the phone, and something in his expression shifted in a way that was private, that belonged to him, and he set it down carefully on the table. The morning was fully arrived now, light coming hard through the north window, the range visible beyond the glass, the empty firing benches standing in the early sun. Evelyn looked at them. 16 positions, 16 empty seats, the whole geography of yesterday's evolution laid out and still. She thought about the shot, the 4 seconds between the trigger break and the radio confirmation, the way the range had gone completely quiet in those 4 seconds, 40 people all doing the same involuntary thing, which was holding their breath. She thought about walking back from the rope line with the case in her hand and the notebook under her arm, and the particular quality of a silence that had shifted from ridicule to something it didn't have a name for yet. A lot had happened in 20 hours. Most of it could not be undone in either direction. The shot couldn't be unfired, the files couldn't be resealed, the names in the IG referral couldn't be unwritten. Whatever came next would come next, and it would not be simple, and some of it would be painful in ways that had nothing to do with her. But Donovan's daughter was going to learn the truth about her father. That was not a small thing. That was the whole thing, actually. Everything else was structure around it. She picked up the coffee and drank it. It had cooled enough to be useful. She looked at the window, at the range, at the empty benches in the morning light, and she was aware, in the specific, quiet way of someone who has been carrying something for a very long time and has set it down in the only place it was always meant to go, that the weight she'd walked in here with was not the same weight she was going to walk out with. Different. Not lighter, exactly. Just distributed the way it should have been from the beginning. Cross left the conference room at 09:20 to deal with Hargrove, and Evelyn stayed at the table with the coffee cup and the window and the particular aftermath of a room that has processed something heavy and is now simply a room again. Rourke came off the wall and sat in the chair across from her. He didn't say anything immediately, which she appreciated. He just sat there with the ease of someone who has learned that silence between people doesn't require filling. "You okay?" he said finally. She thought about it. "I don't know yet." Fair answer. D'Souza had collected his jacket from the back of his chair. He paused at the door. "For what it's worth, ma'am, what you did yesterday. The shot. I've been doing this a long time. I've never seen anything like that." Rourke said the same thing. "Rourke's right." He looked at her steadily. "And what you're doing now. That takes something different than shooting straight." He left without ceremony, which felt right. Flores finished his paperwork and excused himself. The two range officers followed. Aldrich stayed, working his tablet in the corner with the focused self-containment of a man who understood his job was to keep things moving and had no ego about doing it quietly. Kane was still at the table. He was still writing. His account had filled 6 pages of legal pad and showed no sign of stopping. A man who had started talking and discovered that the volume of what he had to say was larger than he'd estimated. He wrote with his head down and didn't look up, and Evelyn looked at him for a moment and thought about the version of this story where Kane was the primary thing. He wasn't. He was a mechanism. He'd done what mechanisms do, translated pressure from its source into action. The source was Hargrove, and the pressure had been running for 9 years, and Kane had been one of the components through which it expressed itself without ever having to show its face. She wondered if he'd understood that about himself. She suspected not entirely. She got up and left. Cross found her outside, which surprised her. She'd expected to wait longer. He came through the main entrance of the conference facility at 09:38, and the expression he wore was the expression of a man who has completed a difficult task and is not satisfied with having completed it, which was different from the expression of a man who has failed. "Hargrove," she said. "He's being transported to the base JAG facility." Cross stopped beside her and looked at the range, the same direction she'd been looking. He invoked national security emergency provisions. The certification for that filing requires co-signature from a committee chair, which he has. It's been filed. She felt something tighten in her chest. That stays the IG process. It initiates a contest period, 90 days during which the classification dispute is adjudicated through a committee review. He paused. In 90 days, without momentum, these things can get buried. "I know. I've contacted both senators on the Armed Services Committee staffers I reached last night. They're aware of the filing. One of them is already talking to committee counsel." He turned toward her. "This isn't over this morning. I want to be clear with you about that. You were clear with me last night. I want to make sure it still landed this morning." He held her gaze. "The process is going to take time. Hargrove has resources and connections and 9 years of practice managing this specific situation. What we have is a formal IG referral, Carver's file, Kane's testimony, and your account." "And the photograph," she said. He was quiet a moment. "And the photograph." She looked at the range. The morning had fully arrived. The sun was high enough now that the benches cast short shadows, and the desert beyond the firing line had gone from the amber of early light to a flat, bleached gold. The target positions downrange were invisible at this distance, just the landscape. She thought about the call the night before, the voice she didn't have a name for. He was on the radio. Somewhere out there was a man who had been carrying his own version of this for 9 years and had made a phone call from a position of risk because she'd taken a shot on a Nevada range, and the shot had cracked something open. "Sir," she said, "what happens to me now? In terms of assignment?" Cross looked at her. "Fort Carson is one option. You go back, you continue what you've been doing, the process runs on its own timeline. That's the low-profile path." A pause. "There's another option." She waited. "The marksmanship evaluation program," he said. "The reason we were here yesterday. The Army has been trying to develop a precision engagement training curriculum that actually accounts for real field conditions. Variable wind, temperature extremes, non-standard ranges, the kind of problems that the standard qualification process doesn't prepare people for." He looked at the range. "We had 13 of the best shooters in the inventory on that line yesterday, and none of them solved it." "I know, I watched." "You didn't just watch. You built a model. You collected data for 90 minutes and produced a correction framework that solved a problem that modern optics and computer-assisted ranging couldn't solve." He turned back toward her. "I want you to run the program." She was quiet. "Not propose it, not advise on it, run it, design the curriculum, establish the training methodology, certify the instructors. He paused. It would mean a new assignment, probably brag, at least initially. It would mean coming out of logistics permanently. She looked at the range for a long moment. The IG process, she said. The families. You said 30 to 60 days for notification. Yes. I want to be available for that, whatever form it takes. That can be accommodated. She kept looking at the range. She was thinking about Reyes, who could read a range almost as fast as she could, who had been 26 years old with a gift so natural it looked like something he'd been born with rather than something he'd built. She thought about what it would have meant if someone had given him the right framework earlier, but not the talent, which was already there, but the methodology, the patience, the understanding that the problem is solvable if you're willing to wait long enough to read it properly. She thought about the 13 men who'd stood on that line yesterday and failed not because they lacked skill, but because they'd been put in a situation without the tools to solve it. How long do I have to decide? She said. I'd like an answer before you leave Blackstone. Then I'll have one. She looked at him. Give me a few hours, sir. He nodded and went back inside. She stood alone on the concrete apron outside the conference facility and let the morning do what it was doing, which was simply continuing regardless of what had happened in the past 16 hours. She drove to the range, not for any tactical reason. She drove there because it was the place where everything that was now in motion had started, and she wanted to see it in the clear morning without anyone else present. She parked in the gravel lot and walked to the firing line and stood at bench position 1, not the position she'd used, which had been position 7, but the first one, where the first of the 13 men had settled yesterday morning with full confidence and come away empty. The desert in front of her was enormous and still. At 4 kilometers, the target positions were invisible to the naked eye. Just open terrain, the slight color variation where the hardpan met the sandy soil, a cluster of range flags barely visible as small, dark shapes against the pale background. She thought about Reyes. She thought about him specifically and deliberately, the way she'd been avoiding doing for years, because thinking about Reyes led to thinking about the conversation she'd had with him the night before the 4th operation, when he'd described to her, with the particular mixture of precision and enthusiasm of a man who has found the thing he's best at, his theory about reading mirage at distance. He'd been working out a framework, he said, something about correlating surface shimmer with upper-level wind patterns, using 2 separate observation points to triangulate movement rather than estimate it. She told him it was a sound concept. She hadn't had the chance to tell him it was actually brilliant. She stood on the firing line and felt the wind against her face, variable, the same cycling pattern she'd clocked the day before, and she thought about what it would mean to build a curriculum around Reyes's concept. To take the thing he'd worked out and never had the chance to apply and put it in front of every serious precision shooter in the inventory. She thought about what he would think of that. She was fairly sure she knew. She walked back to the truck. She sat in the cab for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and called a number she had for a woman in Colorado Springs. A woman she had never spoken to in person, whose name she had found through a combination of methods she'd rather not catalog, whose daughter was 9 years old and had never met her father. The phone rang 4 times. A woman's voice, cautious. Hello? Mrs. Donovan, Evelyn said. My name is Evelyn Hart. I served with your husband. I know this is unexpected, and I know you've been told things about how he died that aren't true, and I'm calling because that's about to change. And I wanted you to hear it from someone who was there before you hear it from anyone official. A long silence on the line. Are you still there? Evelyn said. Yes. The woman's voice was very careful, the voice of someone who has been on guard for so long that receiving something genuine feels like a possible trap. How did you get this number? It took some work. What do you mean it's going to change? There's a formal investigation being opened. It's being handled by the military's Inspector General. Someone will contact you through official channels within the next few weeks. What they'll tell you is that your husband died in a combat operation, not a training accident. That he performed with complete professionalism in a situation that went wrong for reasons that were not his fault and not his team's fault. Evelyn stopped. I was with him. I saw what happened. He did everything right. He was trying to get his people out, and he didn't stop trying. Another silence. longer. He knew, the woman said finally. That's what I used to tell myself, that whatever happened, he knew what he was doing and he chose it. A breath. But the training accident, I never believed that. It never felt like the right shape. It wasn't, Evelyn said. I'm sorry you had to carry that. The line was quiet for a moment. You said you were there, the woman said. Yes. Were you with him at the end? Evelyn looked at the windshield, at the desert through the glass, at the flat bleached landscape she would carry the memory of for the rest of her life. No, she said. I was at distance. I was the shooter. I was covering the team. Did he know someone was covering them? Yes, he knew. Another silence, but different now. Not the silence of guarding, but of absorbing. My daughter, the woman said. She's been asking questions about him, more lately. She found a photograph of him in uniform and she carries it to school. A pause. What do I tell her? Tell her he was good at his job, Evelyn said. Tell her he understood what he was doing and he believed in it. And tell her the people who made the decisions that put him in that position are now being held accountable for those decisions. She stopped. That's true. All of it. The woman made a sound that wasn't crying exactly, but was something near it. The sound of something that has been held in a particular position for a long time beginning to move. Thank you, she said, for calling. I should have done it years ago, Evelyn said. I didn't know how to do it safely until now. She hung up. She sat in the truck with the phone in her lap and the desert around her, and she made 3 more calls. Marcia's brother, who lived in Portland and answered immediately and said very little, but listened with complete attention, and at the end said thank you in a voice that suggested he'd been waiting, in some form, for exactly this call. Ito's mother, who was 81 and lived in Fresno, and who cried without restraint for approximately 90 seconds, and then asked, with startling composure, whether her son had been afraid, and Evelyn told her no, which was not entirely true, but was true enough to be the right thing to say. Reyes's older sister, who answered in Spanish and switched to English when Evelyn identified herself, and who said she'd known from the beginning that the official story was wrong because Marco never made mistakes. He was too careful. He was the most careful person she'd ever known. He was, Evelyn said. He was incredibly careful. He was also the most naturally talented person I've worked with. The sister was quiet for a moment. Did he know how good he was? He was working on something the night before he died, Evelyn said. A framework for reading wind at distance. It was brilliant. I've been thinking about it for 9 years. That sounds like him. He was always working on something. A pause. What happened to his framework? Evelyn looked at the range through the windshield. I think it might end up as part of a training program, she said. That teaches what he was figuring out. He would have liked that, the sister said. He always wanted to teach. Tempt. She found Cross in the administration building at 12:40. He was at a desk with 3 phones and the expression of a man managing multiple lines of a complex situation simultaneously, which he was. He looked up when she came in, and the question was on his face before he asked it. Yes, she said. I'll run the program. He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded, once, and something in his posture shifted. Not relief, something more functional than that. Like a piece fitting into a structure that needed it. Good, he said. Sit down. We have a lot to plan. First, Hargrove. Where does it stand? The national security stay is filed. The contest period starts the clock. Committee counsel is reviewing the legitimacy of the certification co-signature, because there's a question about whether the committee chair's authority extends to this specific classification tier. He paused. If the co-signature is found invalid, the stay collapses and the IG process resumes without the 90-day pause. How long to determine validity? 2 to 3 weeks. Maybe faster, depending on how much attention the committee council decides it deserves. He looked at her. The photograph. Carver's file photograph. I want to include it formally in the IG record. Is that acceptable to you? Yes. A pause. All 6 names on the record. Farrow, too. Farrow is currently alive, I know. She left the service 4 years ago. She's in Oregon. Evelyn had tracked Farrow the same way she'd tracked the families, carefully, indirectly, over time. She deserves to know this is open, and her account of the fourth operation is going to be more complete than mine in some respects, because her role gave her different visibility. Cross looked at her steadily. You've been in contact with her? No, not directly, but I know where she is. Will she talk to the IG? I think so. Yes. She paused. If someone asks her properly. I'll ensure it's handled correctly. He made a note. Now, the program. I want to move fast on the structure, not the implementation, that takes time, but the formal proposal. I want something on paper that I can take to SOCOM command within the week, because I'd like to get the assignment locked before Hargrove's people have a chance to create complications. She sat across from him. I need to build it around field conditions, not range conditions, but actual field conditions. Variable wind, temperature extremes, elevation changes, non-standard timing constraints. Everything the current qualification process ignores because it's easier to standardize. Agreed. The data collection methodology. That's the core of it. You can teach anyone with baseline talent how to shoot in a controlled environment. What you can't teach easily is how to read an environment that's trying to confuse you. She paused. I have a starting framework. Someone gave it to me a long time ago, or the beginning of it. I've been adding to it for 9 years in my head without intending to. Cross looked at her with an expression she recognized from the range the day before. The specific recalibration of someone who keeps discovering that the scope of what they're dealing with is larger than the last revision of their estimate. Put it on paper, he said. This week. Whatever you need to get started. She thought about Rourke, who had 14 years and the right instincts. About D'Souza, who had moved off the wall with such quiet efficiency that she hadn't consciously tracked it, but had noticed the result. About the 13 men who'd stood on that line and failed not because they were inadequate, but because they'd been given an inadequate framework. I'll need 2 or 3 of the shooters from yesterday, she said. Consulting basis initially. I want to work through the curriculum with people who've run real precision engagements, not just competition shooters. Rourke and D'Souza have already asked, Cross said. She looked at him. Asked what? Whether there was going to be a program and whether they could be part of it. He allowed himself something that wasn't quite a smile. The compressed version that men carry when something works out the way they'd hoped, but they don't want to perform satisfaction. That was before I'd spoken to you. She absorbed that. Okay, she said. Bob. Raymond Hargrove was escorted off the Blackstone installation at 14:15. Evelyn saw it from the window of the administration building. Not deliberately. She happened to look up from the desk where she'd been working on the program outline when the vehicle passed. A government sedan, base security following, moving at the pace of something procedural and unwilling. Hargrove was in the back seat, and she could see his profile. The gray hair, the precise posture, the expression of a man who was being moved between positions and was concentrating on his next move rather than the current one. He hadn't looked in her direction. She went back to the outline. At 1600, Aldrich appeared in the doorway with a tablet. The co-signature question, he said. Committee Council issued a preliminary finding. The committee chair's certification authority does not extend to classification Tier 7 without a full committee vote, which was not obtained. He paused. The stay is invalid. The IG process resumes immediately. She looked at the window. The sedan was long gone. Hargrove was probably already through the main gate, already on his phone, already working the angles that remained to him. There were angles remaining. There would be complications ahead that she couldn't fully anticipate, and some of them would be significant. That was true, and she had no illusions about it. But the process was running. Donovan's file was open. Thank you, Major, she said. Aldrich nodded and left. She looked at the program outline for a moment. She'd filled 3 pages in the past hour. The structure was there. Not polished, not complete, but there in the way that solid things are there before the details accumulate around them. Data collection methodology, environmental reading protocols, the 2-point observation system that had been Reyes's concept and was now going to be the methodological backbone of a curriculum that would run for as long as the Army thought precision engagement mattered, which, she expected, would be a long time. She wrote Reyes's name at the top of the methodology section, not as a dedication, as a credit. He'd developed the core concept. That deserved to be in the record. At 17:30, she was done for the day. She gathered the outline, picked up her jacket, and walked out to the parking lot. Rourke was leaning against the passenger side of her truck, arms crossed, watching the range. Heard the stay collapsed, he said. About an hour ago. Good. He looked at her. D'Souza and I are getting food from the mess before it closes. You should come. She thought about it. Her instinct was to say no, to go back to room 14 and work on the outline and not have to navigate a meal with two men she'd known for 36 hours in the specific way of people who've gone through something together without having established the normal social scaffolding first. Her instinct, she had learned over the years, was often optimizing for the wrong thing. Yeah, she said. Okay. They walked across the installation in the late afternoon light, and the desert had gone back to amber, the same color it had been yesterday afternoon when she was lying behind a rifle waiting for the right window, and the range was full of people who thought they knew what they were watching. The light was identical, and the desert was identical, and almost everything else was different. The mess hall was half full, the clatter and ambient noise of a military food operation doing its end-of-day service. They got trays and found a table near the window, and Rourke and D'Souza talked about a training evolution in Montana that had gone wrong in a specific way that was apparently very funny in retrospect. And she ate her food and listened and put in occasional words where they fit and didn't perform anything. The program, Rourke said at some point. What's the first thing you're building? The data collection methodology, she said. Everything else comes after that. The wind reading thing you did yesterday. Expanded, more systematic, with a second observation point for triangulation. She paused. Someone worked out the theory years ago. I'm finishing it. Rourke looked at her with the expression he'd had on the firing line the day before, the one that was assessing and respectful in roughly equal measure. Who worked it out? She picked up her coffee. Someone who should have had more time, she said. He nodded and didn't push. Cross found her outside the mess hall as she was leaving. He had his phone in his hand and the expression of a man who has just completed a significant call and is still inside the weight of it. Hargrove, he said. He's agreed to cooperate with the IG investigation in exchange for a conversation about his formal status. He's going to give them names. He's already started. Cross looked at the range. The sun was getting low and the benches were in full shadow now. The deputy undersecretary. Two others I don't have names for yet, but will within the week. A pause. He made the calculation that cooperation is more survivable than obstruction at this point. She thought about Hargrove making that calculation. The specific mechanics of it. A man who had been running a protected position for 9 years, watching the protection dissolve in 48 hours, arriving at the math of what remained. Kane, she said. Kane's account is in. He's being cooperative. His testimony is going to be useful. Cross paused. I'm not going to tell you he didn't do what he did, but he genuinely didn't know about the intelligence failure. He knew the files were sensitive and he didn't ask the right questions about why. That's a very specific kind of not knowing, she said. Yes, Cross agreed. It is. She thought about Kane sitting at the table filling legal pad pages with the handwriting of a man trying to give an accurate account of himself. She thought about the specific texture of that particular effort, not absolution, just accuracy. You could respect the effort without liking the result. What happens to him? She said. That depends on what the IG finds and how his cooperation is evaluated. He won't stay in his current command. Cross looked at her. You probably already knew that. Yes, sir. Is there anything else you need from me tonight? She thought about the outline in her bag. She thought about Donovan's daughter carrying a photograph to school. She thought about Reyes's name at the top of a methodology page that was going to be read by shooters who hadn't been born yet when he was working out the theory in the field. No, sir, she said. I think I'm okay. He looked at her for a moment. That same quality of attention she'd registered from the first conversation in the tent, the look of a man recalibrating against new data. For what it's worth, what you did on that range yesterday and what you did in this building today. He paused. Both things mattered. I know, she said. That's why I did both of them. He allowed himself the compressed non-smile again. Get some rest, he said, and left. She went back to room 14. She sat at the desk with the outline in front of her and added 3 pages before she ran out of momentum, which was the right time to stop. Momentum is information, and its absence tells you where the thinking needs more time to develop. She put the pen down and looked at what she had. 12 pages. The beginning of something. She thought about the version of herself who had driven to Blackstone yesterday morning with supply manifests and a deferred maintenance request, who had sat in the truck cab for a moment with the rifle case visible through the back window and the sound of shots carrying across open desert. That version had made a calculation in the space of about 30 seconds, or had finally acknowledged a calculation that had been running for years without permission, and had done the thing that couldn't be undone. She didn't know, sitting in room 14 at Blackstone with 12 pages of a training program outline and the desert outside the window, whether that version of herself had been brave or reckless or just tired of a particular kind of smallness. She suspected all three, which was probably the most honest answer. She thought about Donovan's daughter, who was going to learn the truth about her father. She thought about Reyes, who was 26 years old in a photograph and who had been working out something brilliant. She picked up the pen and wrote one more line at the bottom of the last page. Not part of the curriculum, just a note to herself. 3 words. She looked at them for a moment, then closed the notebook. She turned off the desk lamp. Through the window, the desert was enormous and dark, and the stars were out in full. The way stars come out in places with no light pollution and nothing to hide them. She looked at them for a while without thinking about anything specific, which was its own kind of rest. Then she lay back on the bed, boots still on, and closed her eyes. Heat. 6 weeks later, she stood at position 7 on the Blackstone firing line. The morning air was cool. October had found the desert and changed it. The hard pan a darker gold, the shadows longer. The light arriving at an angle that made the range look wider than it did in summer. A group of 12 shooters stood behind the observation rope, hand-picked from 4 different units. All of them were serious. All of them had looked at her without recognition when they arrived, which was appropriate because what she was to them at this point was an instructor, not a legend. She had decided she preferred it that way. Rourke was at position 8 with a data card and a spotting scope. D'Souza was downrange with the observation team, running radio. Aldrich was at the command table with the evaluation documentation. She turned to face the 12 shooters. "Yesterday you shot the standard qualification course," she said, "at ranges up to 800 meters. Most of you scored well. A few of you scored exceptionally. That's not what we're doing here." She looked at them steadily. "What we're doing here is learning to read a problem that is actively trying to deceive you. Wind, temperature, pressure, the way mirage moves at distance and what it's telling you if you know how to listen to it. You are going to learn to collect data in field conditions, build a real-time model, and use it to solve engagements that your current qualification training did not prepare you for." Mipas. One of the shooters, a staff sergeant from a ranger battalion, confident without being aggressive, raised a hand slightly. "Ma'am, what's the target distance today?" 4,000 meters, she said. The group was quiet. "The same conditions that were present when I took that shot are present today," she said. "Variable southwest wind, 11 to 14 knot baseline, gusting pattern on a 12-minute cycle. You will all attempt the shot. None of you will hit it today, and that's fine. Today is about learning to read the problem." "Os, she paused. "By the end of this program, most of you will hit it. Some of you will hit it on the first round. The difference between those outcomes is methodology, not talent." Another pause. "You have more than enough talent. What you're here to build is the framework that talent needs." She looked at them, 12 people in the early light of a Nevada morning, carrying in their hands and minds and training records the potential to do something that had seemed impossible until it wasn't, which was the nature of most things that mattered. She thought briefly of Reyes. She thought of his name at the top of a methodology page, which was where it was going to stay. "All right," she said, "let's start with the wind." They started with the wind. 3 months after that, Donovan's daughter sent her a letter. It arrived at the Bragg address through a forwarding arrangement that Evelyn hadn't expected to be used and was surprised to find she felt something about when it was. The handwriting was 9 years old, large, round, careful, the script of a child who has recently learned that letters have a specific correct shape and is proud of achieving it. The letter said, "My mom told me about you. She said you were there and you tried to keep everyone safe. She said my dad was brave and you knew him and he was good at his job. Thank you for telling us the true thing. She read it twice. She folded it and put it in her notebook, between the last page of the training methodology and the inside back cover. She had carried harder things in smaller spaces. This one she would carry differently. The people who dismiss you are measuring you against what they're willing to see. The only question that matters is whether you know your own worth well enough to keep working until the moment arrives when the measurement is out of their hands. Most people who have ever been underestimated know exactly what they're capable of. They've simply been waiting for the right distance, the right wind, and enough silence for the truth to finally carry.